to this second in-person meeting of the Cherry Creek Steering Committee. We have quite a few people online, I believe. As many of you know, Brooks had a little health emergency, so he is going to try to join us from home, but he had to go in and have his ticker toyed with. So we all couple cents. So we all wish him a quick recovery, and we'll miss him tonight. But I did speak with him on the phone, so tried to tell him how to get on and get some questions going and everything else. So, so we'll get going right away. As I always remind people, we don't keep written minutes anymore. Last week's meeting and those that I was able to record are up on YouTube under the Cherry Creek North Neighborhood Association website. You can find them there. I think they last forever once they're on YouTube. So, and we'll go right to council persons updates. And I know we have Nicole here. Nicole works with Councilwoman Sawyer. So I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Aviles. Thank you so much for introducing me. I'm with Councilwoman Sawyer's office. Not too many updates on my end. We did postpone our spring parks cleanup day to this weekend. Hopefully the weather will play nice. If you know anyone that is doesn't have anything to do, we need some volunteers for the Cherry Creek Trail this weekend, so we'd love to have you. We are also doing a trains intention day on the 19th of May. For those folks that are interested, I can get you our information. Those are all the updates that I've got right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Are there any folks online from Councilman Cashman or Hines districts? Seeing none, we will move ahead and get some updates from the bid.
Yep, great. Well, summer is here. Things are starting to bloom. So just a few announcements on events. We're going to do a summer concert series this year. It'll be a little bit different. We're going to do this out on Fillmore. So this will be on Saturdays, June 1st, 15th, and 29th. It'll be in the late afternoon and early evenings. We will have a concert series out there with probably a few bands and different things going on in Fillmore. So please come out and enjoy that. So that'll be new for us, doing it in that format. We have the Smash Fine Arts Show on Saturday, June 8th and 9th. Of course, we have Arts Festival coming, and we've already looked at that layout, and it's going to be very similar to last year. So expect the same, but 3rd Avenue will be open, so we'll have access for residential coming off alleys. We're going to do Bastille Day in the district this year, which will be something new. So we have a whole French festival. That's going to be July 12th through 14th. So we're really excited, everything French in Cherry Creek. Sidewalk sale, July 18th and 21st. 5280 will be back with their Top of the Town event, which is great. It's very similar to Food and Wine. They're taking it through 5280, so we're excited to have them back. And we'll cancel, kind of finish up the summer with the final Smash Fine Arts Festival show on August 10th and 11th. So a little busy with events. On top of that, we are actively working on a parking management plan and a strategic security plan for the Cherry Creek North neighborhood. So for the bid air boundaries. So really good things are coming out of that. We're getting a lot of traction on parking conversations. Now we can maybe do things that better impact the residents. So we have more employees off the street parking where they should be. That's something that we're really trying to focus on. And then the strategic security plan, we've done an evaluation of the district, and we have that evaluation. Now we're starting to work on that strategic plan with our consultant and just really trying to push forward the most important things we can do, which is keep the area safe and clean and well lit and have some great events.
Great, wonderful.
So we have going on.
It's a lot of information. Really fast. So bravo. Okay, and we don't have anybody from the mall here right now. So we'll go ahead and move on to our, unless anybody has any questions. So far, we'll come to our presentation this evening, which is focused on the Cherry Creek West presentation by the developer. So now is the time to listen, ask questions. Amy did indicate that if we had more detailed questions that she needed to get answers from her team, we will take those down, and she will attempt to do that later. So think of this as a continuing discussion. So with that, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me again. Yeah, I think it's nice knowing that there's been a lot of question been in this process with the city for over 2.5 years now. And so a lot of question about what has changed, what hasn't changed, all those kinds of things. So this will be somewhat comprehensive. I'll go through some things that people have seen before because we have some new members and so on, but I'll go relatively quickly over some of that information. And if people have more questions, I can cover it. I'll go through some of the process of the rezoning and all of the other entitlements that need to happen as part of this and a little bit on the timeline for that. And then certainly have lots of time for questions, which I know certainly can cover things like traffic, but they can also cover anything else that might come up. So thanks again for having us. And then just quickly, Jenny Jacobs is here with me as well. She's our development director who will be in charge of this for us. All right, so high level, just again, going through what the program is, and that is the overall site, inclusive of roads, is 12.86 acres. It includes Cherry Creek North Drive, and that includes also all of the internal streets and sidewalks and so on. It is roughly 4 city blocks. You'll be able to see this here in another slide that I'm going to share shortly, how this compares to Cherry Creek North. We'll have 7 buildings, so 2 buildings per each of these blocks. 4 of them will be residential, 3 of them will be office as our current plan exists. And then we'll have ground floor residential and services, or sorry, restaurants and services. There will be some residential. That'll be some of what we'll talk about when we get to the rezoning and how that timeline has gone. As you can see, a couple of other features, 4 acres of open space. And part of that feature is certainly those main areas that we've talked about a lot, but also the fact, and this again is part of the reason our rezoning has taken so long, we don't have alleys, which is a little bit difficult, I think, for the city to get their arms around how they think about. We'll talk about that a little bit. Our buildings are all 4-sided. Our parking is majority below grade and shared, which is great. The idea that we've had since the beginning of having this be a place where you can park once, whether it's for here or for other areas around Cherry Creek North, that still applies. And we intend to get this completed in 2 phases, and I'll talk about that a bit. So again, really the idea of all of this was that we would design this to put everything within a 15-minute walk. And really thinking about how to connect to the creek and to the communities around us and how we would set things up based on all of that. So this is, as we've discussed also, the first meaningful open space in Cherry Creek. There's a lot of little sort of pockets of open space, and some of them are not even clear about whether they're available to the public or they're really private. What we want to have is a place that everyone considers their front yard, that everyone considers an area that they can use, whether it's just to pass through, to spend some time, whatever that may be, and whether you work or live here or you are from one of the surrounding neighborhoods. And again, this really shows those courtyards that are in between the buildings as well, where you would typically see an alley. The context slide, again, I think it's really helpful because when you talk about acreage, it's hard to really understand how much that is. But you can see by comparing to say 4 of the blocks between 1st and 3rd to the north, how this really compares. You just kind of take that, turn it 90 degrees, and our blocks are about the same size. The density is defined. We really started from the ideas of Blueprint Denver, the Cherry Creek Area Plan, which showed this as CCN 12 zoning. And it was not rezoned at that time because Taubman and Buell owns the land, were not ready to do that. They didn't know what they wanted to do with it, and they really wanted to have someone come in to help them think about how they would imagine this. So now that's happening. I wanted to walk through, I mentioned in the last meeting that we have 41% of our buildable area dedicated to open space. I got a question afterwards about how I got to that, so I wanted to walk through that here quickly. When you look at our site, unlike a typical site in Cherry Creek North, where someone's buying a lot that doesn't have streets or sidewalks in it, we needed to show how we would back out streets and the cycle tracks and the University Greenway and so on, so that you can actually get to what is a traditional buildable area. That leaves us with 9.2 acres of what would be developable property. We're building buildings on 5.4 acres of that, which leaves us 3.8 acres of open space. So that is not trying to include any of the sidewalks that would otherwise be provided otherwise, or things like that. That is really just all of these paseos between the buildings, Market Square, the central green and the confluence, those kinds of spaces. So when we talk about that open space, that's what we mean. Hopefully that clarifies some of that. I'll go through the renderings relatively quickly because you've seen them, they've been in the press. But again, this is the confluence. This is if you're standing at First and Clayton, and you are looking diagonally towards the center of the site through the area that we call the confluence. You can see Market Square beyond, and you can see the buildings on either side. I wanted to, though, because the plan has continued to move through city process, also elaborate a little bit on what kinds of improvements we'll be doing along First Avenue. And I want to be clear, none of these are moving into any traffic lanes. These are all happening basically within our existing sidewalk to our site. So you can see the existing street lanes. Then you can see we're adding a two-way cycle track along First Avenue. That's consistent with the Denver Moves desires. And also, I think, a really nice alternative for someone who is going to be who's maybe been coming from downtown and they're going to be exiting into Cherry Creek North. They can still go the typical route, or they can go down First Avenue. Then we'll have a wide tree planting area, and then we'll have a separate sidewalk. So we're going to have a really wide space between where our buildings start and where the street ends. And all of that happens within our area. I'll note there's also other things that we're working through, like more like better bus facilities and so on that we're working through in our TDM plan that we've been talking about. So a couple of precedent images around that, but I think this is an image this group hasn't really seen that I wanted to share. We've talked about the green. That continues to be a feature and really the neighborhood's new front yard that we speak about. This is looking at it from the south towards Market Square and towards the buildings. We've also shared this site in the past, and the fact that this shows, I like to say you're standing on top of Nordstrom. So if you're standing on top of Nordstrom looking between the two buildings in the first phase, you can see the green on the left, Market Square on the right, and then how this street that goes through the center of our site is going to function. You can see there's bollards there. The features continue to exist, that this is designed to be pedestrian prioritized. So it's all at grade. If you are rolling from Market Square to the green or vice versa, you're at grade. There's tactile and visual cues to make you look either way in case it is open to cars. And then it can be closed to cars or open. How we're going to work that out is one of those continued conversations we're having with Dottie as far as how we do that in a way that we can document it, make everyone comfortable, but not make us all bound to something that we can't change over the course of 100 years or so.
Amy, before you change.
Yeah.
So that balcony in the lower left or whatever you're calling it, is that one of your buildings?
That's part of one of our buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of a terrace on that building as we've shown it. And we haven't fully designed these buildings. We're kind of waiting until we get through our process to get into this in detail. This is a view of Market Square looking east. So again, you've got Market Square off to your left when things are closed. If they are fully closed for a large event, this kind of shows how people can move freely through that space. And then you can see the green beyond. Cherry Creek North Drive, and I'll talk a little bit more about this one. This is an example of one of the other things we've been talking to with the city in our rezoning process. Right now, Cherry Creek North zoning does not allow residential as a first floor use. And in certain cases, that makes sense. When you're facing the properties to the south of us, for example, all of that is very residential character. And so they agreed that it makes some sense to have some residential that meets the street on the south half of our site. So we're working through the details of that. That again is sort of a detail that needs to be addressed. We will be adding a substantial sidewalk here so that people can move freely on this side of the street. But then as we've talked about, Cherry Creek North Drive, which is now just 4 lanes of pavement, will become a really nice treed landscaped space that's much more comfortable. And that features this pedestrian crossing. So for those of you who've been following this for a long time, this had been something different at one point. It's all now at grade. But pedestrians are prioritized here too. So pedestrians can move across here. Cars will stop along Cherry Creek North Drive on their way to the shopping center or on their way back. And then on the left, you can see our public parking garage entrance. That's one of the many entrances into the garage. We wanted to have one that was prominent so that everyone felt like they weren't only parking in someone else's apartment building or someone else's office building. I think that will help make sure that people are comfortable and it can easily find parking, which I know is one of the conversations the BID is having about how to make sure parking is utilized here in Cherry Creek North. Then on the south side of Cherry Creek North Drive, we are working with Parks and Rec on additional trail improvements. So we've talked about this a little bit here, and I'll have another slide that kind of talks about the detail of this. This is the narrowest section of the Cherry Creek Trail because the creek wall drops off pretty precipitously here. So right now it's pretty dangerous. Bikes that are commuting are going pretty quickly. Pedestrians are moving more slowly. We needed more space here. So we're going to work to make these improvements, add additional lighting, things like that. This is a little bit of a cross section, again, from our infrastructure master planning that we're working on around this design. There will be two places that you can cross. Those pink arrows show right in the center, adjacent to the green, as well as pedestrians and bikes at Clayton. And this shows the width of that. The bike path itself is 14 feet and the pedestrian area is 4. So that's a good wide 18 feet that will make it much easier for slower users, recreational users, and high-speed folks to exist together.
Amy, just a quick question. Is the sidewalk elevated above the level of the cycle track?
In this location, no. This is the Parks and Rec has a specification they've asked us to use, which is the crusher fine
Okay.
structure. Crusher fines would be directly adjacent. So much like you see elsewhere on the path, like out to the east, where you see that crusher fine version, and then you have the hardscape path. And that's much wider than a typical cycle track. So that if someone who is in a wheelchair or someone rolling a stroller or something wants to be on the paved portion, they can be too. Hopefully there's enough room for everybody. So Clayton Lane, then another aspect that we've really been able to work on extensively. Again, all of these improvements will happen within our site. So the 4 lanes that exist to get people in and out of the shopping center will exist. That's their property, not ours. So we are adding a 2-way cycle track that's 11 feet, a tree planting area, and a sidewalk. So very similar to what we're doing along First Avenue. All of those improvements will happen along that edge. And then, not least, University Boulevard is a greenway. And so, but you wouldn't know that today, right? It's just a sidewalk and parking lot. So this will have 2 rows of big trees with plantings in between, and then the sidewalk will be inside that. So well away from the University Boulevard traffic. And so that will then move into our site. For those of you who know about all the utility work that had happened recently, I don't know how you could miss it if you've been around here. All of that stuff is under where these trees are. And that's where that was done with this idea in mind, that there would be a nice wide greenway here. So I wanted to step into a little bit on our rezoning process, and I won't belabor this slide. I think most of you have been through many rezonings around here. Large development's a little different in that if you're over 5 acres or going to substantially impact things, you go through LDR. That process for us was 14 months. The idea is that you were getting all of the departments together on all of the different things they cared about, and they would come together on a framework that we could then use towards these future processes. So that process is over. That's long gone at this point, but we have since that time been working through the primary goals of the rezoning and infrastructure master planning. And during that process, talking to all of those departments and more. CASR isn't listed here, their sustainability, for example, lots of departments weighing in here. So the deliverables that you'll see when we finally are ready to do this are a zoning application. We'll be working on an infrastructure master plan. Our fourth version of that is in with the city right now. Urban design guidelines, because we are going to be bringing ourselves into the CCN design review. And then a development agreement that outlines the things that don't go in a sort of technical zoning document, but that covers things like our affordable housing and any of the other elements. So when we started this process, and even when we got all the way through LDR, what we thought we were going to be doing is basing this in CMX 12. That is not what makes sense after all of our conversations with the community as well as with city staff. Clearly, CCN was thinking about this as future redevelopment. CCN is our baseline, but we can't just do CCN because so much relies on alleys in CCN. There are other things that don't apply, and I'll go through a list on those. So we have a draft that we're starting to work through with the city, and hopefully very soon we will have that in everyone's hands so that you all can review it alongside us before we get sort of to the finish line, and we can make sure we've talked about everything together. So again, why a PUD? There's a lot of unique characteristics that can't be otherwise considered. Our hybrid and private streets being one example. Much of zoning, if you understand the technicalities of it, is really measured off of a public street. And without those and without alleys, the city had to figure out what to measure us by. So we've been working through that as it relates to build to and mass reduction, active uses, that residential component on the ground floor, and transparency. All those things that are very well thought out in the CCN zoning needed to be thought about for this and for these buildings that we have here that have the four sides to them. Then integrating the Cherry Creek North design standards and guidelines, we will become a new sub-area 3 for that addresses some of those unique characteristics and will be under future review by that DAB. We are limiting our height to 168 feet or 13 stories. So we've been talking about that 13 stories along the way. That keeps us well underneath the Cranham Review Corridor and allows us to do the plan that we've been talking about all this time. So those fundamental points about how to make these things happen is what we've been working on with the city for the last year and a half, say. So again, CCN as a baseline, because it has so much thoughtfulness to it around height, siting, where the setbacks happen and why to allow light to come into CCN, design elements and other uses. So we are working very closely with that team, the team that's evaluating everything else that happens. It doesn't have to be rezoned in CCN is looking at this and trying to think about how this would relate for them. But it really gives us a comprehensive way to be reviewed against the same kinds of things that CCN is being reviewed against. So that's really the rezoning document, which has been the thing that has been taking the longest to get to what do the words actually need to say. The infrastructure master plan, however, has made a lot of progress over the course of time. And so, as I mentioned, the fourth version of that is in and is being looked at alongside the mobility study that we shared last time. This has the standards for sidewalks and cycle tracks and all of that. So those diagrams I was showing you are excerpted out of the version 4 of that infrastructure master plan, as well as public realm improvements, how all those things are going to work. It provides our open space commitments and the typologies, what those features are going to be. It addresses the operations. That's that component I mentioned we're still working through with Dottie of how we're going to, when those streets will be open and closed to pedestrians or cars, utility work that has to happen, and then the TDM plan, transportation demand management plan. So typically that happens at the SDP stage, and I referenced this a little bit last month too. We believe that evaluating transportation demand management on a site-wide basis provides the best, most effective way of doing that that will actually result in trip reduction. So we are working through drafts of that. There's a draft that we've shared with Stuart. We have another one we're pretty close to sharing with you again. And we've been working with Chris Nevitt and Nathan Pope at the city on that as well. Another small additional nuance that I didn't want to give a whole slide to is we are technically the same lot as the shopping center. Dividing from something that has existed for 40 years is harder than you might imagine, but that is well underway. So here's a little bit on that transportation demand management plan. There's way more to this. There's a whole big matrix about all the different things that we're going to be doing. But by doing this and really focusing a ton of it in our phase one improvements, we think we can make an even bigger impact. So we'll have shared paid parking, a flexible, sustainable transportation incentive fund, a mobility ambassador to help people think about all the best ways to get around. Bus stop amenities, I mentioned that. It's not just going to be stand next to the little sign and hope the weather's good. Bike storage and maintenance hub, e-bike and scooter share loaner programs, both for residential and office, mobility kits to really help people think about all of these options. And then eco passes on the neighborhood scale are called NECO passes. So thinking about that. We've already been talking again with transportation solutions about that, but clearly we've outlined with the city too, until we get more regular transportation, those are unlikely to get a ton of use, but we think they're good. So we are only required to do about 12%. We're going to do over 20% when all is said and done. Many of the strategies we've also brainstormed are from other markets and they don't have percentages attached to them. Those will be above and beyond that percentage. So we're really taking this very seriously, knowing that traffic is one of the biggest concerns for this neighborhood. A massive transformation of surface parking to open space. This really, again, outlines those orange areas are the streets that we've carved out. The white hatched areas are our buildings, and then the green is the other open space that we have. So again, not to belabor that, but that is really a major difference in from what is here today, but also well beyond what the city requires, which is 10% open space. Lastly, our development agreement, the big components of that are the affordable housing agreement with Host. That's well under negotiation, 12% affordable housing at 60% AMI, as we've discussed. That is essentially $52,000 for a single person or $59,000 for a two-person household. That targets workers in the shopping center and Cherry Creek North restaurants. But it's been interesting talking with employers about how many people actually meet those requirements. That might surprise you. And then there's a linkage fee that's paid on office buildings. We'll be paying twice that linkage fee into the city, so they can also leverage those dollars towards affordable housing in other locations as well. And then when you enter LDR process, there's also an equity component for consideration. This is not an area with equity concerns, but nonetheless, we think it's important to consider. So we are commissioning a study with EPIC, if you're familiar with them, Executives Partnering in Childcare, on a childcare provider. That's one of the big things that we discovered is a major need in this community. It also happens to be part of the mission of the Buell Foundation. So that's really well aligned between our two missions. We are working on making a portion of our retail below market rate. I know you guys know that Matt Joblin has spoken about that in the BMC site as well. Construction apprenticeship programs, it's a big deal. There are nowhere near as many construction workers coming into those programs, and particularly from disadvantaged groups. So working with those, and then definitely a place for the farmers market. That's a snapshot of a few things. Having space for the community to meet and things like that is also something that's important to us. And then I mentioned the Buell Foundation and their mission, but there's structural impact in the fact that there is a ground lease here. So they get payments every year from the existence of this site. So we were able to help with their mission as well. So our phasing and timeline, phase one will deliver, and so that's surrounded in blue. Hopefully you can kind of see that up in there. It covers the first three buildings, one office building, two residential buildings. It has the green, it has Market Square, it has Confluence, and then it has the connections across from at First and Clayton for bikes and pedestrians, as well as across to the creek. All of those creek improvements and that connection to the creek, all of those things will be happening in phase one. And, the bike facilities and so on and so forth. We will be starting our demolition and utilities in late summer of this year, start digging the hole, as it were, the big hole, probably first quarter of 2026, with our first building completing in the fall of 2028. And then hopefully we'll start construction on phase 2 around that same time. Phase 1 will complete as a whole in spring of 2029. So about 6 months before or after that first building delivers. And then all of Cherry Creek West, we would hope would be complete by by spring of 2033. So it takes a while.
Yeah.
To do this. But it also speaks to the fact this is different, than one individual building coming up in Cherry Creek North, right? This is 7 buildings. And so, as we talked about some in last month's meeting, right, the people coming into this community, it's going to take some time for them to get here. One thing actually that I do want to note that I don't have a separate slide on since we've got the phasing open. I've talked about this in previous meetings, but it's been a while. That west side of our site where phase 2 is where we are going to stage park construction workers and do all of that so that we can keep those impacts out of the neighborhood. And then some of those workers can then park underneath in our garage as things move around. So we recognize that has been something that we've heard a lot of in these meetings is people's concern around that. And so we are taking it seriously. We've also talked to the shopping center about any excess space they may have. So we can really keep our impacts to ourselves. So I have some slides that I can follow up on traffic. I can either cover some of these points now, and maybe I can just do that. And if there are additional questions that come on that or on anything related to the development, I'm happy to talk about it. But a couple of key points I'll just reiterate from last time. When you work and you live in the same community, that reduces traffic because people can make the decision not to get in their car. The planning really was done to create a walkable, bikeable community from the start. The fact that we are not building lot line to lot line, and I've spoken about that, all the open space, the space we're leaving undeveloped, means that 41% of our site is open space. So this development is not as big as you might think of it as otherwise being because of that. The number of buildings is substantially reduced and it doesn't add up to maybe as much as you might think as far as gross square footage. The fact that as part of this early planning that we get the cars off of the main thoroughfares immediately and have right in, right out intersections will reduce the impact to the streets that surround us and keep cars moving. And our infrastructure improvements to the surrounding area will make it easier for people to choose other mode shares, whether it's walking, biking, using transit on all 4 sides of our property. And then I mentioned that the transportation demand management strategies are being integrated at the master plan level now. Some of those things can impact not just our trips, but trips from others. If other people want to come across and use our bike hub, for example, that is not just for our residents and office workers, it's for anyone to use. So as one example. A couple of additional notes I wanted to make. The site previously, when it was a big box, I covered this very briefly, but when it was a big box site before, it generated more traffic than is expected here when it was fully occupied. So back when Bed Bath & Beyond and Container Store and Brio, Macy's, and what's that, Cost Plus, all of that, because they were all single-use trips. And so they did an analysis and there were substantial reductions when that was detenanted. And so we think that is something that needs to be considered. If this is just sort of left in this set of uses, that's not helpful. We also talked about through traffic last time, so I won't belabor that point. But I did want to talk a little bit about the methodology of the study. I know that came up from Buzz. This was coordinated with the Denver Moves Cherry Creek team, as well as their team that does the mobility studies. It uses national standards. And in the details of that, if you need us to get the specific section and book, it's version something of some letters. I can get all that to you. We covered impacts on 11 intersections, so it's very comprehensive. I focused on First and University in our last conversation because that's really what our comparative studies had been talking about. And so the letters are the highway capacity manual. So it's like HCM 6 version. It was the determiner of our levels of service. So, they're giving review of our mobility study now. If they've got any significant problems with the methodology or how it's being done, we'll hear about it and we'll hear about it soon. So we'll keep you apprised, but I did want to put up here the 11 intersections that we did study because there, are a lot that are both directly around our site, but some that are just outside our site that could be impacted. And so we worked with city teams to determine which ones we studied. Also mentioned last time, and again, I don't have to go through this too much, but the affordable housing will help reduce work-related trips. We coordinate our site infrastructure with Denver Moves Cherry Creek. There are 4 specific things in the Denver Moves Cherry Creek plan that relate to this area that between us and BMC, we're all evaluating. I think we're committing to a good portion of those. The one exception is the one that you heard from us last time that neither of us agree is the right one, which is the mid-block connection. I think, again, when the city reviews our mobility study and probably BMC's, they will probably not want that connection either. But all of the other suggestions we are agreeing to pay for in our round of this. And our shared paid parking garage is being developed in 2 phases. So we can learn as we go, which is important. Last point there is just the redevelopment takes time, which I just kind of talked about. But what that means is the traffic we do generate is going to be coming in over time as other improvements start to happen. So I have that traffic study result slide. We can come back to it, but really that was the baseline presentation. I know I wanted to leave some time for people to ask questions today. So I can pull up the program slide and I can go back to any of the slides that anyone might have questions about or take any other questions that maybe I didn't address.
Question. For the affordable housing, can you tell me how many units it will be, or is it 5 per building, or
It'll happen.
down the height, or?
It'll happen throughout, or, that's basically the way the plan suggests it. It's about 100 units that will happen throughout. So there'll be just for simplicity's sake, it's probably about half of those in phase 1 and the other half in phase 2.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah, you bet.
Somewhat related to that, I know your master plan phase, but do you know approximately how many people the retail buildings are bringing and the residential, just sort of ballparkish?
How many residents will?
Residents and office workers.
So when we've thought about this, do we know?
Got 430 units
Yeah.
in the first phase.
Right.
So
If you assume
some of those will be single.
1.5 per, so then that's 645, 650, somewhere in that range, residents in phase 1. And then in the office building,
We're saying 200.
but some of
Square
that's
feet.
retail.
That's true.
So the office building, it's all going to depend on the density. It really, I think we're more likely to have relatively low density tenants like Cherry Creek North has, right? The nature of without having a substantially transit served area. But I know we did some analysis on this, on how many workers we
Maybe
thought this would be.
600, just if we're saying 300 square feet per.
That would be a super dense. So if we had a super dense office user, it would be 600 employees, but that would be a lot. I would think.
We talked about restricting MOB so that we don't have a medical, there are certain office uses that, for example, on the Gateway project, we negotiated that they wouldn't do MOB because that's so many trips. People come for an hour an appointment and they're coming and going. So I don't know if you thought about.
We haven't, mostly because it isn't what we were targeting. Candidly, medical office buildings are a very different infrastructure setup, and it's not what we developed. We never developed.
Right, it's not your bill house. So
So
would you consider saying no MOB?
we can definitely talk about that.
And then another quick question. Have you, this is gonna sound like selfish. Have you thought about a senior housing?
Like that.
I think I mentioned actually in some of the very early meetings that we had, the first 5 calls that we got from our press release were from luxury senior housing developers. So yes, we have. We do not have that targeted for phase 1, but that most certainly could be considered. There's some complexities to how our ground lease is written that would need to be ironed out. I don't think that's impossible at all because we could certainly use more of it here. The market studies definitely suggest that according to these providers. So yeah, that's a possibility for sure.
At one time, didn't you have like townhouses? You're thinking about like along Jericho Drive, like at the south end of your project? Or is that just,
That is part of the rendering. So let me go back to this is ground floor residential. That is part of a larger building.
okay.
Sorry, it's coming back slowly. And when I just move quickly, it doesn't, oh, where did it go? This guy. Not yet. It's still, there we go. So, part of, given in Cherry Creek North, you have mass reductions at a relatively low level. There's a really unique opportunity to create this residential character on the ground level. It's not allowed in CCN to do something like this. So we would do this, but then the rest of the residential building goes up beyond that. There's a setback and then the residential goes up from there. The city does not want just townhomes there, nor do we, candidly. But this really creates that feel at the street, which we're pretty excited about.
Just one other thing too, those buildings, we know about the height and all that stuff like that. With your green park and stuff like that, it's gonna be in the shade a lot. Those buildings are up against it. I don't know.
We've actually done a lot of shade studies, and part of the reason that that faces south is really to allow for as much as we can. And the setbacks that we arrange for our buildings will really create some opportunity to bring sun into that space.
Okay.
But it's definitely a consideration, as is how we provide shade to folks that are using that when it is in full sun.
Mhm.
So,
Have there been any discussions about utilizing this common space? I know that since you're working closely with many of the things that BID has to offer, the design guidelines, the design review board, but the use of Fillmore, as Richard just said, Fillmore now is being used for several different things and over the summer, but having some coordinated uses with like the Fillmore.
I think we would definitely want to coordinate. There is, and actually, we're doing something similar to this down in the Central Platte Valley. One of my meetings this afternoon is the meeting where everyone talks about what's happening at Union Station, what's happening in Riverfront Park, what's happening in the areas in between, because everybody has their, you wouldn't believe how many different separate organizations there are downtown. But you have to coordinate those things or everyone has music on the same night. So we would absolutely want to continue. We would want to coordinate with the shopping center. We would want to coordinate with the BID. And to the extent that there are events that might utilize both, that really help encourage that connection, I think that would be great. So we're all for that, for sure.
Amy, I have 2 questions that came from other people and I couldn't answer.
Okay.
First, with the low-income housing, is it allowable to give, say, teachers at Bromwell preferential treatment on the low-income housing?
It's an interesting question. that I think Host has been considering. Sean, I don't know if you actually know the answer to that. I've been hearing some rumblings about things like that, but I don't know if they've made any specific.
Yeah, I think there's a fair housing.
I was just gonna say, yeah, they're fair
It's
housing.
come up so frequently. I do think that, as Amy mentioned, the agencies.
Yeah.
Trying to find ways that you can do that. It's a good question for the attorneys, actually, and we can circle back. on that.
Yeah, for sure. Because there was also conversation about, could you have some amount of them, reserved to make sure that they're supporting retail here in Cherry Creek North, as well as in the shopping center and all of that. But the initial sort of reactions from hosts are like, I don't know if we can do that, but I know they're thinking about it.
Okay, great. The other question that I was asked was, how do you plan to deliver the TDM program given the phasing? Are there aspects in the second phase that are part of the core TDM program?
Great question. The next version of the TDM draft that you see will have that outlined, what happens in phase 1 versus phase 2. But most of the big stuff happens in phase 1 because we have to set up our master association at the beginning. So the flexible fund, the mobility ambassador, a lot of the communication strategies and so on will set up in phase 1. The bike hub, the office and residential Nico passes, like all of those kinds of things really happen in phase 1. When Marielle, who couldn't be here tonight, was kind of going through the detail on that, we were pleasantly surprised on how easy actually it is to deliver most of it in phase 1, because that's going to be a question for the city too. How do we know that you'll do all the things on this list, right? And so if we're doing more than we need to in phase 1, which I think is going to be easy to do, then that's not a problem. Yeah. Share that with you.
You mentioned Nico Pass multiple times. Sorry for dominating. This is my question. Are you looking for a trigger that would cause you then to provide Nico passes to tenants? Like when the BRT opens for business, then you'll provide Nico passes to residents.
You know, I think what we'd like to do, and would love to chat with you some more about this, is, and this is where we talked about this idea of the transportation fund.
Yeah.
What we want to do is have some money that's set aside for whatever's going to be most effective. So if at the beginning, we don't see that anybody's going to really be using transit passes, then if there's something else that we can be doing to help people use another mode, we want to use those dollars towards that.
Yes.
We'll watch, and you'll be able to help us with this, and the city will be able to help us with this. When it seems like more people are going to want to use transit and a Nico Pass be effective, then we can do that too. So that's why we kind of wanted to set it up as a little bit of a menu. Things will change over time, and you know, years later, they'll change again. There'll be some other cool thing that none of us have thought of. And if we want to pivot to that, we want to pivot to that.
Sounds good.
So, great.
How about some questions from the side? Anybody?
I have a couple of questions for you. Who's the GC on this job?
We don't know yet.
Great question.
It is a great question. So we have been, we've been sort of waiting. We've had a lot of conversations with several different general contractors preliminarily, but until we were a little closer in, no one's going to guarantee us a team until they're a little closer to the job. But we do want to start having those conversations starting potentially as early as next month if things continue to progress with our rezoning application. It'll take several months to go through that. There's a lot to talk through, how to divide the pie or whether to divide it at all. It's a very complicated site. So.
How about financing? You get it all arranged yet?
Our equity is fully committed, and we've had preliminary conversations with some banks.
Right.
That's about as much as you can do in this market, as you know.
Right.
You know, how many square feet of retail are you projecting for this project?
Our baseline is right around 96,000 right now for the overall.
So you said that's pretty consistent with what you've been saying. So if you convert some of that retail on the south end to residential, that starts eating into the retail number, isn't that correct?
No, that residential has always been something we contemplated along that south end. We were not, until we decided to shift to CCM zoning, we thought that was.
Okay, so you're still at 96.
Yes.
And is any of that more than one story? Is it 2 or 3 stories? Any of that retail?
We haven't fully figured that out. Our first priority will be activating the first floor. Whether some of that wants to go upstairs. Like if we had a wellness provider, maybe that it made sense for them to be up on 2. We may do that. Childcare is another one that could go up on the second floor, for an example, so that we can have a nice outdoor space for the kids, without it being sort of like right there. So those are a couple of things that could be exceptions to that.
So if you do have that ability to go up 2 or 3 stories for your retail, that increases the number of square feet for retail for your total.
No, this
You're
is,
gonna borrow from one.
Yeah.
Give to another.
yeah, I mean, again, we don't know. We haven't designed these buildings at all yet, exactly what's going to happen, but that's sort of our baseline as we think about it. We laid it all out as being on the first floor, as we imagine it. But if more residential on the ground floor makes sense, and it makes sense to put something upstairs, or if we end up, I mean, we're not restricting ourselves. So if we wanted to do less, if we wanted to do 80, we could. If we wanted to do 110, we could. It's all going to be a matter of master planning these things and thinking about how we provide the right mix of things to create something vibrant. And as we start getting into the design of these first 3 buildings, we'll be able to hone in that number some more.
Well, the reason that is an important number
Mhm.
is because that drives the retail the traffic count.
Yep.
Because retail generates
Sure
the
does.
most amount of traffic.
Mhm.
So if you're afforded the luxury of being able to move that 96 to 136 or whatever, and it sounds like that you have that flexibility, or you're going to ask for that kind of flexibility, that is a constant changing number of traffic trips. So I'm having trouble understanding how you can say what you've said about generation of traffic if retail square footage is a constant moving target. Then that means that the traffic count is a constant moving traffic.
And that's true.
If you were right at 96 and we stuck at that,
Mhm.
we can pencil it out. But as long as you have the flexibility of increasing that number, because a tenant might want 2 or 3 floors, then that traffic count increases dramatically.
There's nothing right now in any of the sort of form-based zoning in CCN, for example, that prohibits somebody from playing with how that's used. BMC's development, for example, has a rooftop restaurant on it. And so it's typical that you can generally play around with uses. Sometimes you'll create sort of large buckets of that if the city has something that they want to encourage. For example, in the Central Platte Valley, when that zoning was created 25 years ago, they wanted to encourage more residential. So they built that whole PUD, which is one of the old style PUDs, to encourage residential. But nothing in that said you couldn't do more retail. There were certain locations they didn't have retail allowed, but nothing in that said you can't do those things.
Yeah.
Nor does anything in any of the rest of the CCN zoning.
You're not really answering the question.
Yeah, no, you're right. If we decided to make the whole thing, 5 stories of retail, that would substantially impact.
So the minute you deviate from that 96, that document that you came in with that was about 2 inches thick really has no validity.
Well, it does. You would just apply the same things, and yes, traffic might change.
Put in another.
But similarly,
What you presented so far for traffic on that 2-inch study is based on 96.
yes.
And if that starts changing, going up, then
And that could change that. Similarly, we just did a sort of estimate of how many residents will be here. If we have, if our unit sizes change, that could change. If the number of people who live in any given unit changes, that could change.
Mhm.
If the density of our office users changes, that could change. And that's true of every traffic study. but you take the best estimate that you can based on the national standards. You establish that, you make your best guess as to what you think you're going to fill this community with, and you establish that. So yes, all of that could be different. How this populates could absolutely be different. The number of people who come as guests could be different. And many of those people, it also only assumes the TDM reduction of 12%, despite the fact that we are doing substantially more than that. So that's the other component that's not it's not baked into that number, is the additional trip reductions that we're committing to. So all of that, and that will be committed to in the separate document, so it doesn't mean we're not committing to it. But the mobility study is not one of the commitment documents. The TDM document is, so that's where that gets documented.
But so if you're gonna do the PUD, you've got a lot of elbow room in there. You just basically are painting the picture of what you've got up there on the screen right now, but it doesn't go on to the inside of those buildings. It doesn't state how many square feet of retail that it needs to have or how much retail.
It does not.
Excuse me, residential, the size of the residential unit, whether it's two-story, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, how many square feet. So all those things are, and you say you're out to 2033. And by 2033, the product mix of retail, residential, and office could have a completely different demand than it does right this second. So what I'm saying is that there's so many variables that it's like very hard for us to for anybody to wrap their head around what the traffic count is likely to be, because
it's about the same though as it was when the CCN 12 zoning was created 10 years ago. You had about the same level of certainty. You were creating boxes of 3-story zoning, 5-story zoning, 7, 8, and 12. And then assuming what was going to happen in them. You've set up all sorts of requirements in that zoning to get the outcomes you cared most about, which is why we said, let's use CCN instead of CMX, which has all sorts of different things that relate to maybe citywide goals, but CCN had certain goals. And so similarly, nothing will stop another developer on another site from changing the uses and how they're going to utilize any given site, the site in the middle of Detroit, BMC's site, the Waldorf site. People can do whatever they want on those sites as long as they comply with CCN zoning, including the parking requirements.
But a PUD zoning has different constraints, but you still have provided yourself with a great deal of elbow room. And I understand that. If you can get away with it, that my hat's off to you on that.
It's actually the city's desire.
But I just think what you're talking about, that was then, and this is now, that was pre-COVID. We have the benefit of looking at what happened in Cherry Creek after the rezoning, and a lot of it is too dense. A lot of the people who are at the bargaining table, so to speak, are sorry that they went up as high as they did in certain areas. So it's not a total kumbaya with the rezoning that we went through before. And we can learn by our mistakes. And you, quite frankly, are going, in my opinion anyway, and the opinion of our board, you're going in the opposite direction than we wish you would. We wish the buildings would be smaller and there'd be less people, less traffic. Stuart pointed out last time that the answer to congestion is density. I happen to be one of the representatives from Country Club, which is basically catty corner from your development. And of all the RNOs and all the neighborhoods in all of Denver, there's less people living per square foot in Country Club than any other in the entire city. We're made up of 380 single-family homes. There's no apartments or anything like that. And so I can't hope, I'm trying to explain to you why we have frustration on our part. We can't speak for anybody else. We can only speak for ourselves, but
Sure.
you know, if you wonder why, well, what are these guys upset about? I'm laying it out to you, just like you lay your out with facts, figures, and numbers. I'm giving you facts, figures, and numbers as it applies to your neighbor, just across the street.
Diagonally across. And I understand that. I will say if we had the CCN zoning, these buildings would be much closer together. They'd be required to be. So these paseos that you see between all of these buildings would have to be narrower because we would have to use alleys. So the amount of light coming through the space and the amount of density that we would have to do under CCN zoning at 8 stories would be at least as dense as the total number of square feet that we'll have here. And yet would have less interest, less visual interest, less light, much less open space for people to move through. These paseos are, you can walk through this 8-story building and the 11-story building freely between them. Anyone can. And you can do that in an alley in Cherry Creek North. You're probably not going to choose to. Not that it's unsafe, but it's not as pretty as the sidewalks for sure. So I hear you on that, but the fact that we have left so much of the space here between the buildings open and can do that because of these things that we've worked with the city on means that we might not be as dense as you're thinking we are. If you compare these to an existing Cherry Creek North block and how close those buildings are together. We've looked at other sites in Cherry Creek North as a developer, and I've thought to myself, I don't know that I want to build that close to people, right? It's a factor of the zoning. We're trying to really speak to that and provide a little bit more breathing space in Cherry Creek West. So I appreciate your comments, Buzz.
It's pretty consistently remained at about 1.3 million square feet. Is that correct?
It's been, so we are at 1.5 million, I think, pretty consistently. Yeah.
That is a little from my
We
recollection.
might have, like, when you do net, might be less than that. When you, like in residential, you don't count corridors and things like that.
Is there a vehicle within the PUD that will cap that? Or as Buzz has alluded to, is that something that's going to continue to float? We then can't really get a handle on how big it is in terms of built square footage.
There is not. The city has asked for a height limit and a stories limit, and that's the 168 feet and 13 stories.
As you continue to work through, is that something you could consider because you have the development agreements that haven't been discussed? But as you continue to work.
We have actually a great piece of the development agreement has been done, so, or has been sort of worked out.
Question from the very, at the global level, you started out with a very high density on the site. Is there something that is driving that density that's causing you to start at that point? You could have started at 8 stories everywhere. I mean,
Yeah, two things are driving that. And it's the fact that we started from Blueprint Denver and the Cherry Creek Area Plan. And both of those suggested that the city was looking for significant density at this site. We did not want to spread that density, to use one of our planners' terms, like peanut butter across the site. So we have some buildings that we're reflecting as being lower because we think that that really adds a lot more interest, and this will look more like something that's been created along the course of time by doing that. But it was starting from Blueprint Denver, which called this a regional and urban center, and then Cherry Creek Area Plan designating this as CCN 12. So that's where we started. We started with that idea, with the connection ideas, and with the creating significant open space. And those were our 3 primary provisions
You did it because you could do it.
Well, we did it because we felt like that's what the city and the community had asked for.
Well, the city is consistently over asked of Cherry Creek. We have become the development queen of the entire region. And that's not necessarily what the people, the residents and the people within the vicinity want in the way of a residential center. So starting with what the city wants, I mean, I've hoped that the city all along would start new Cherry Creeks and create other centers, which helps with the traffic and disperses the concentration of development of Cherry Creek is approaching what I think in modern urban living is going to be a maximum.
And they have done a little bit of that with Golden Triangle, where actually they've done what they haven't done here, which is create the ability to do pin towers that are relatively unlimited and things like that. That has not happened here, but Golden Triangle definitely has a substantial densification.
Much more urban context than.
Certainly, but it was limited like this was, but only a few years ago.
Doing it, you can, because you think the city will let you do it.
Well, and no, I mean, I think that characterizes us as takers, and it's not that. I think we believe that density here makes sense. I know that Pleasantly disagrees with the idea that when you have people living and working in the same place, and you get a certain amount of critical mass of that, that you do have the ability for people to live and work in the same place. And that instead of people driving here from the other side of I-25 or from Glendale or from elsewhere around, these people can live and work in the same place, which I think is kind of a nice characteristic anyway, but it also is a traffic reducer.
That's also a utopian planners kind of concept. I would like to know if Richard, through the Cherry Creek Business Improvement District, or the Chamber of Commerce, has ever documented how many people live and work in Cherry Creek. Because Cherry Creek is a really unique community, and you're not going to get a lot of busboys living here. And I don't know, but you may have 10% of owner manager levels who can afford the residential, even at the affordable housing level, which is what, 300,000, 400,000. That'll be below the median at least.
Certainly, though, when you think about office users here in Cherry Creek North, a lot of those people, just anecdotally from the folks that I've met, a lot of those people walk home to their home in Country Club or in Cherry Creek North and so on. There is a fair amount of that that we've encountered. So
prices of housing reflects that too. I mean, a lot of people like to live here, but they don't necessarily work in Cherry Creek. They're coming in from Cherry Hills because they're sick of the community and other things. I mean, there are lots of amenities in this area, but to continue to densify, consolidate all these impacts in one area is not helpful.
You need to do an analysis that shows us that the people who work in the office buildings can afford residential. Because if they can't, their whole stewards, it just blows up, doesn't even work. It's just a big mess. So you're telling me that somebody who works in an office building, actually, most of these people.
Antero would
are gonna
be a great
able to
example,
afford
actually.
Those folks, $1,000 a month rent.
Those folks from Antero are maybe a great example of that. And we know them well because we built them an office building downtown. So they would be a great example of people who could live in Cherry Creek and could work there, or they could work in the new office building that they're having built in Cherry Creek North, and now they can walk to work. And I happen to know that they're also big cyclists, because when we built that building for them in downtown, we built them a beautiful custom bike room. So that would just be one example I can give you off the top of my head because I happen to know them as tenants. I'm sure there are plenty more. I imagine there are a lot of people in Financial House, in all these new buildings that are being built, in Janice's building, who could afford to live in Cherry Creek West. And maybe that'll be executives, and then maybe some of the folks that can't currently afford to live here in Cherry Creek North that work at Janice could afford to live in some of our affordable housing.
I'd like to ask Stuart to weigh in on this because I think it's you raised, it's a good discussion. Last time when we talked about the fact that Stuart made a point that we're not going to get BRT until we have sufficient density. So when we look at all the other apartment buildings that are being built, like on the Spear-Leasdale corridor over in Aurora, and if we can get BRT that connects some of this, then we know that if it's every 15 minutes, people will actually take a good bus system. But my question is to offset some of this kind of concern, the people who work in the secretaries, and I know at our firm, we gave everybody Eco Pass. They lived everywhere else and they took the train in all the time. Do you think that after phase one, we will reach that kind of density to be able to justify the BRT coming in at that point?
You know, we don't justify much of the BRT. What justifies the BRT is on Leedsdale. And that's where they're expecting the bulk of the ridership. We'll have riders, most definitely. You're going to find young professionals who would prefer just to hop on a BRT to head downtown instead of driving their car and finding that. There are going to also be a lot of cyclists. It's amazing that actually the highest income folks are riding their fancy bikes a lot more when there is good weather. And we hit 8% of our commute share when we surveyed in October was riding their bike every day to work. 8% of the population that works here.
Every day.
In October.
January.
Not as much in January, but downtown is 6%. We're higher.
You're right. It's more than it justifies the
Not every day.
Well, and that's, but my question is, if we continue to densify in these areas, when do we really expect, and maybe this is a good plug for tomorrow. In fact, we both have an extra ticket if anybody wants to go to Transportation Solutions tomorrow. Do I have 2 takers?
I think.
But we have
I
2.
didn't get the details, but I'll talk to you.
Yeah, and, but Stuart, why don't you say a few words about that? Because it's all about BRT. And the real question is, when are we really going to see that happen? And how is it going to be implemented on this major Spear-Leasdale
What we
corridor?
do at Cherry Creek will not affect it very 1% perhaps. Correct.
We're relatively small, given the amount of people that are being transported through the area. But the density is what supports better transit and it supports the frequency. And
It's the commuter that gets on the transit.
yes, and we do employer surveys and they are, we can't aggregate it and say that represents all of Cherry Creek. I can only tell you what select employers do. Often that's Janice Henderson, because they always let us survey them in different things. But it's interesting to see right now, a lot of the businesses that are located in Cherry Creek have hybrid schedules. There's a high level of working from home 2 or 3 days a week for people that work in the finance business or attorneys or other types of professionals. Before COVID, 2/3 of your employment base were the lower income individuals who will want to travel by transit. And we've got to remember that. I mean, when you say we're not an equity area, they measure it 2 ways. One is being a nest community, which is a poor community, or it's a place where lower income individuals work. And we are like that big flashing red light in Denver where a lot of lower income people will work. And we can get them out of their cars like we showed with JW Marriott. If we can get them transit passes, they would prefer to do that.
If you go with the profile of the JW Marriott users, it may have been what the population of people working at a hotel, not a bunch of managers.
Yeah.
General population is busboys, servers,
Yes.
waiters, housekeepers. And that population is economically compromised to the point that they need to use transit, and that's their lifeblood.
Yes, that is correct. And one other aspect that's unique about Cherry Creek is if we got rid of all the cars coming through the area, we don't really have much of a peak because we have service employee, hospitality coming in at 6 a.m. We have restaurants or retailers coming in at 9:30, restaurants coming in at 11 to serve lunch. It's really spread out.
And that's parallel the weekends.
Yeah. Yeah. But we do get that traffic. What causes our peak period is the traffic that's going through here.
On destination user.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't want to belittle the fact that we're building some big buildings here and there are going to be some impacts. But, traffic is just like water. It's going to follow the path of least resistance. The best thing we have going for us right now is that a lot of drivers coming up Leetsdale continue all the way onto Colorado and up to 8 because that route to downtown has improved. If we fix, this is just my opinion, if we fix Steel on First and we fix First and University, we're going to get more cars coming through here. And Country Club's going to be the one that sees it.
Fighting so hard.
Yeah.
Years to
Thanks
get
for the
bridge
good
across Alameda.
Yeah.
Or down Alameda is one of a few full length, city length
Yeah.
corridors in the city, and it would be an ideal transit corridor.
Yes.
And we got so much blowback from big bucks and the neighborhood that Alameda Bridge was. We even had $50,000 donated towards the bridge.
Yes.
Fuel.
Mm.
Yeah.
And instead, they did a little thing on Steel Street with that 50 because it was 20 years later.
Yeah.
Well, and now they're talking about reducing the size of Alameda, and we have a new station. So stand by because BRT is supposed to come. We don't have a lot of time. I know we had 2 questions here and we had 2 questions here. We'll start with Linda.
I'm just curious, and I'm sure you've thought about it, to talk a little bit more about the retail. How do you coordinate with the bid, with the mall and the retail that you're even thinking of? How do you coordinate all of those entities so that it's not?
Yeah,
Of course.
we started talking with both Jeremy and Nick a long time ago. And in the community to just, because we need to think about it as a whole,
Yep.
right? If we talk about this all over the place, if every building thinks, okay, I'm gonna put in a coffee shop and a dry cleaner, right? You can't do that. So we want to supplement what is in Cherry Creek. I think today, so we're not going to be soft goods for one. The shopping center and so much of Cherry Creek North does a great job on that. So we are really thinking that we want to supplement the restaurants where there are some additional opportunities. There are some holes in that. As an example, some additional services, some additional wellness kind of stuff. There's a lot of that, but there could be more in all of those kinds of categories. Childcare was the huge hole that we found, which is why we really want to do that study. So when we talk to people, like one of the things that came up is with all the workers that are here, there aren't a lot of places to grab a quick lunch today. There's Sweet Green, but it's all the way down here. As an example, I know there are more, but we feel like we need more things like that because not everybody can take a leisurely hour-and-a-half lunch. And something, a great sandwich came up multiple times. So things like that. And then thinking about within the ecosystem of restaurants that exist in Cherry Creek North, where are there some additional holes that we could fill? And because all of the brokers work really well together, I think that also will help with that process. And that definitely needs coordination. What's that?
You're not talking about a grocery store, are you?
No.
Yes. Yeah.
Two little slides of all the buildings.
Yeah, you bet.
So how do trucks get in and out there? Where do they stop? Since it's these 4-sided buildings and unload things.
I apologize for anybody on Zoom because when I go stand up next to this, nobody else is going to be able to see that. But you'll see that there are multiple access points. They're a little hard to read on here, but there are multiple access points into all these buildings. Not all of those are car entrances. Many of those are truck loading. And so we are bringing truck loading in off the street. So when we have trash or we have other, move-ins, major deliveries to the office buildings, any of that, those come in. And so each of these groupings of buildings has that coordinated with one another so that one is the car entrance and the other is the truck entrance. And then all of that can be serviced in that way. We will have to, through our master association, work really hard with FedEx, Amazon, UPS, all those guys. It's easiest with FedEx and UPS. I don't want to make it say it's easy because I'm sure you know better than anyone in this room how hard that is. But Amazon is even harder because it's a different every time. At least usually the same UPS driver has the same route.
Our problem is, we're city streets and city alleys, so it's really hard to impact change. Where you have a great, plan to impact change, not to be a problem, because we're really struggling. Part of our parking study right now, and ours is one of our big strategies is on delivery traffic, because we need to do something with it. It's just not working. It's getting worse with the way we're building buildings and alley access to garages. So, you're going to be fortunate to have
And if you,
control of the property.
Yeah, and Gensler did so much work looking at that and sizes of trucks and turning radius and all that kind of stuff as we were looking at the base and the sizes of each of those buildings on these internal. None of that happens out here. It can all happen adjacent to these, and then we'll have some small loading zones so that at least when that Amazon guy didn't do what he was supposed to do, he's at least pulling out of the lane, so that people can continue to get through.
because with restaurants, if you're looking at putting in a lot of restaurants, that's a lot of food.
Yeah, the seafood guy shows up,
Wine,
your guy.
not going. Yeah.
Your guy, your guy.
Challenge, the DoorDash. DoorDash and food delivery folks, they just pull up like in our streets and they park right at right in the street and run in.
Right, yeah.
I had some questions.
Question.
Mary, did you have a question?
Yeah, and we've kind of gone past it, but when Buzz was talking about the retail, I was kind of curious. So this is really a question for you and maybe Stuart, but I'm just curious as when we're talking about density and we're talking about retail, when people come to the area and they park, if the square footage of retail increases, just as a human behavior, do people come to shop and they'll go to Cherry Creek North, they'll go to the mall, they'll go. So it's not necessarily increased traffic with increased retail because people may come and park and go to.
Park once. Our goal is park once.
Yeah.
And
They go to all.
they go to everywhere. We're a walkable community. We're such a small community. And even walking across the street to the shopping center, a lot of people park at the mall. They walk over here to shop and that's their parking spot. And I think that will continue.
And
But
is that pretty much what you see here?
that's that's most of what we see because parking's a challenge here. It's not easy. People find their spot, they're sticking in it.
Right. Well, I know
Yeah.
I do that, so I just thought, when we were talking about it, I just thought, increased retail, because I know traffic is a sensitive subject, but it may not necessarily mean that it is going to be an exponential addition. It'd be more traffic, but people are coming and parking and going to all the retail as opposed to just one area.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, we can be thoughtful about things that are sort of destination retail as compared to sort of part of that ecosystem, to your point. If somebody, that's where having Bed Bath and Beyond, I made the joke that people would come and just get coffee filters, but that is kind of, that's what you're out of and that's what you went and you got. And you probably didn't necessarily, that was a trip that was different than I'm going to go spend Saturday in Cherry Creek North. And so my hope certainly is that whether people do, like right now, my spot, just to give it away, is in Clayton Lane. I can drive in there and park very close to where the elevator is under Crate and Barrel. And I can go easily to the mall and easily over here, even though I can park free over there.
Well, and they'll validate if you go bicycle.
Well, they would.
And the container store. That's what I do.
But, but if we have a lot of the kinds of things that people are only going to come and want to use once, then that's different.
Right.
And so being thoughtful about that too.
We're running out of time here, but I applaud you. You're gonna have an interesting conundrum in front of you because we did an analysis here for all the parking spaces that we had, and it was about 5,000, I think, both surface and in structure.
Yeah.
At the absolute best time for parking and stuff like that, only 43% of it, if I remember correctly, were guys who actually used the parking structures. women don't like to go underground at all. And so it's, I don't
We've
think
heard
it's
all
a
that.
resolution, you know,
We've heard all that, and that's why we didn't want to have parking spaces upstairs, because what we were concerned about, and I think we've been talking about this since the beginning too. If we had choices upstairs, people were going to circle around that block where F and G are through First and University, looking for that perfect surface space, right? We can't have that. So, and yes, I mean, Matt Joblin was like, this is suicide, Amy. You know, I hear him, but if we make this intuitive, really easy to use, I think the bid is working on trying to figure out how you know where the parking is. Like if you can easily tell and you're not worried that when you shoot to that garage underneath, you know, whatever building that becomes your favorite, if you can tell before you get there, great, there's 12 spaces. The chances of someone filling all 12 of those before I get there, no problem. I'm gonna, instead of weaving around, I'm gonna go straight to Detroit. I'm gonna make the turn and that's the garage I'm going for. You'd be much more likely to choose the garage. But until that happens, and until you know your way down that little helix and you know, like, this is the private parking for the residential and this is the usable, that's the big problem. Our whole thing is gonna have all the pucks in it like they have in the shopping center and all of the newer technology even since. So you'll be able to tell, I'm going to that lane because that is closest to the building I want to be in. I can see right now there are 16 parking spaces in that row. That's where I'm heading.
Well, the total scope of things, 97,000 square feet is not very much compared to the whole Cherry Creek environment.
Yeah.
So I don't think you'll have if you could make it or lease it sensitively so that it spurs the population you have, then I think it more of a community serving. I mean, how many more boutique, you know, fashion stores do we need?
A lot of them. Or. To Matt's point, if he's right, that people don't want to park in the garage, that's what the valet is for, right?
Daylight them as they have a charity. Project, you daylight them, take some of the open space and drop it down that first level.
I don't know if you remember that we had that image from the early design. I haven't been bringing those lately, but where the elevator is so that there's real clarity. And then you can tell when you're down in the garage, okay, that is the center of the site. That's where I need to walk to. And then when you come in, you'll remember where you were. That's part of that intuitive.
That's a skill set. Yeah, we only have a few more minutes.
So that-
And then Christine.
Yeah.
Kindergarten, yeah, that is a great one. Yeah.
The parking underground, at least for me, is not how easy the space is or what, it's safety. I just, you know, and I mean, so if you make it wider, I don't know what you can do, but that is my
Controlled,
huge
all those
issue.
that you know.
Underground is,
You know, it's color. We painted the mall parking garage white. You know, it used to be concrete, the mall's parking garage, and we painted it white, and it was not cheap endeavor, but you know, it was really about, you know, safety and lighting, and it gave you a different emotional feel to parking in that garage.
right.
That's
Yeah.
Christine.
So a grocery store's out of the question?
Well, no, I mean, but I think if we were going to do something, I think it would probably be something boutique and grab and go-y, not Safeway or something.
Yeah.
The traffic impacts of that are certainly a big one. And candidly, the city doesn't want, one of the things I didn't, you know, one of the other nuances here is what they don't want is for us to combine buildings F and G and the base podium, right, as a single building. They definitely don't want that. And that's the kind of thing you would have to do to get a larger grocery store. So the city doesn't want it either.
Farmers Market be nice.
You know, it's something,
It's fine.
what's that?
If Whole Foods just restocked more. It would be just fine. Well, we are just about to finish up here. We've got 2 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, especially as it pertains to traffic issues, the 2-inch traffic study, as Buzz pointed out, the shade study, which I think to David's question, you said you had. So those things may be, if we could make them available, if they are downloadable from, or if you upload them to the Cherry Creek West site, so we know that if people really want to look at it, they can.
Yeah.
And then in reviewing that, if you do have questions, please get those questions to me or direct to Amy, but I'd be happy to.
I'm on the list.
Questions.
So when you guys get all the steering committee emails, I'm in there.
She's in.
So.
To that traffic study slide, I'm sorry.
Very, there'd be some absolute limits on your P and D, and not all this wishy-washy stuff on what the total square footage is, where it's committed, and then you design the buildings to that, but start working on some hard numbers. We've gone from 1 13-story building to 3 13-story buildings, and a couple 8-story buildings now instead of just one.
Those have been actually consistent.
It's just something I just love, we can't get our arms around.
Well, there are opportunities once the BUD gets filed to talk about development agreements and commitments like no MOB or those kinds of things. So we can't really have.
Trying to remember where.
Until we get that one step further, we're really looking at it, but we can do that.
There's a 7 PUDs.
No, it's one PUD for the site
One PUD for
in 2 phases. But that's where we can start having some of those conversations. So think about those kinds of things because, and there are a couple of them, that we've done, the one for Gateway, for example, where, because this is a gateway corner. So we've already said, Amy, we're going to be talking about what that gateway looks like. And she's working on that. So this is an important corner for.
That's in the area plan, the idea that there is monuments that
The gateway.
identify both at our site and at the Whole Foods site, slightly outside of BMC site.
Yeah.
Location.
So we've been talking about that. And if you want to see what some of that language looks like, look at the Gateway Development Agreement that's on the Cherry Creek North Association website, where we actually said, when you get rid of these pork chop lanes, the speed lanes through.
That was successful.
We want it, well, hey, it's recorded in property, so it is still there. That it will be, that the owner and the developer would light it and wet it, as I used to say. And then we would, as a community, decide, what does that look like? Does it, we don't want it to look exactly like the country club gates and the flowers there, but we want it something to be Cherry Creek. So we can start thinking about, what does that look like? What impact can community have to that
I
kind of
think
thing?
you're going to talk to once a PUD is filed.
The PUD gets filed and then we can have conversations with the developer about it. That's how
That's how it works.
it's how my experience has
I
gone.
have PUD, and that's not how.
Well, you don't talk to the county.
Well, no, you talk to the developer. We've worked very successful with very many developers. And maybe that's not your experience, but it certainly has been for good developers who work with the neighborhoods. That's where we can get some traction. It's the same time that conversations are going on about the transit management plan. And so the conversations are going to be had. The development agreement with the city would be different from maybe some of those nuanced things that we want to talk about, like what does the gateway look like? So, and I've told Amy, we'll have those conversations and we're, and it's beyond a good neighbor agreement. These are things that we want to make sure
This is not
get done.
true, but once it's filed, you don't talk to your council person.
I can't talk to my council person, but I don't know that means you guys can.
She is not going to engage, even now, she is not going to engage.
Right.
She has already considered this at this point to be too close to filing. So I think that's why she is really not participating in this. So,
That is correct.
but
In our behalf.
well, but we have a seat at the table before planning board. The filed RNOs do have a seat at the table. It is a formal rezoning. We have an opportunity to have those discussions. And in my experience, if you are fair and you understand what you're asking for and you're reasonable, that most good developers will work with you, because the last thing they want is to have a bunch of RNO people who've been involved in this community forever standing up at council or at planning board and saying, hell no. So I anticipate that will happen. Good developers have been very willing to do that with us. And if you want to see what one of those looks like, take a look at that one. And with that, we are 3 minutes over. I apologize. Thank you for being here, all of you, and those at home. Thank you. Good night, everybody. We're adjourned.
Once the plans are set,
It's the back.
however, it's done.
Nice to